Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I would like to welcome our panel this afternoon and the university community that everybody that has joined us for this webinar. World Refuge Day is an international day designed by the United Nations to honor refugees around the globe. World Refugee Day is celebrated annually to honor the courage, strength, and determination of women, men, and children who are forced to flee their homes under threats of persecution, conflict, and violence, and they are able to join other countries or find refuge in other countries. It was therefore decided that as from 2001, 20 June will be celebrated as Refugee Day. Today, that's why we are here, even though that the 20th of June is over the weekend, so we felt that it's important that we gather today as well to celebrate World Refugee Day, which is celebrated around the globe. We know that there are now nearly 80 million refugees and people displaced around the world. The International Rescue Committee is providing relief to millions in war zones and other countries in crisis in Europe, where refugees continue to seek safety. And we know that in our continent or in this region, it's said that over 18 million are affected. That number has soared in recent years, partly due to the ongoing crisis in the Central African Republic, Nigeria, and South Sudan. It has also grown as a result of new conflicts erupting in Burundi and Yemen. Over 25% of the total global refugee population are part of the global diaspora in the wake of the 10th year Syrian crisis. So as of, we are in 2021, and apart from everything that is going on around the world, we are also faced with the pandemic. We know that COVID-19 is growing. Just recently, South Africa has gone back to level 3. We are trying to deal with the pandemic, even though there are other challenges that we face as societies and as a continent, and also elsewhere in the world. So I wish you all the best, and I wish that you will engage constructively and also make sure that we discuss these issues that we are facing as people and also as the continent. I would like to, before I leave the podium, I would like to introduce our facilitator this afternoon, Ms. Thandeka Juma, who is the lecturer in the School of Law. She is an attorney of the High Court with a lot of experience and expertise in international refugee law. She has practiced in the area of refugee law in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. She has attended the School of Forced Migration Studies in the University of Oxford, and worked at human rights as well. And also she has also managed various refugee programs while working as an attorney at Lawyers for Human Rights. She has worked closely with the agency of the United Nations, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and other international organizations such as the International Organization for Migration, in addition to being a lecturer at UKZN School of Law, as I mentioned earlier. She is the supervising attorney at the UKZN Law Clinic, specializing in civil matters such as evictions, domestic violence, and applications for refugee visas. I would like to welcome Ms. Duma, and also Ms. Duma will then introduce our panelists who are here with us this afternoon. And thank you again for making the time to be part of this discussion, and also for everyone who has joined us this afternoon. Thank you, Ms. Duma. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. A very good afternoon to everyone. So I'm going to be introducing the three panelists that we have. Each speaker is obviously going to have not more than 15 minutes as provided in our agenda to give their presentation. So after the third speaker, then we're going to have a question and answer session. So our first speaker for today, okay, I have to start a video, all right. Okay, so our first speaker for today is going to be Mr. Tufule Feli Simtumule, who is the Executive Director for Consortium for Refugees and Migrants in South Africa. And he has worked for Black Search Trust as a paralegal advisor, where he led the refugee task team, as well as a social auxiliary worker and researchful worker for various organizations. And he holds a postgraduate diploma in labor law from the University of Johannesburg, and also various certificates from the University of Cape Town and the University of Pretoria. He also holds a BA in social work and also has a certificate in sociological research. So his main interest is as refugee protection, promoting the rights of refugees in South Africa, and his particular interest within the refugee community is children and women. So thank you so much, Mr. Simtumule, for joining us today. I'm going to hand over to you to start your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, University of KwaZulu-Natal, for inviting us for these critical discussions that we are commemorating the World Refugee Day, which falls on the 20th of June of each year. As Norma has rightfully indicated, that the day was proclaimed back in 2001. You can tell that it has been some years that the World Refugee Day has started, or we have started to commemorate it. It's an unfortunate circumstances that we are commemorating the World Refugee Month or the World Refugee Day in the amid of the situation that took place in various areas yesterday on the 16th of June, where quite a number of refugees and migrants who are living in South Africa, some were displaced, some had to close down their businesses, some they have to relocate and seek refuge to the relatives where this displacement and the violence that was taking place against them was not taking place. So thank you very much. My name is Tufule Feli Simtumule. As Tandek has already introduced me, I'm the Executive Director for the Consortium for Refugees and Migrants in South Africa. I hope everyone can see my slides. If one person can confirm.
Yes, we can.
You know, the technological working area.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Remember, now we are working in the technological affected area, and it's not easy when somebody is not confirming. So when we received the invitation, we were asked to look at the topic of an integrated perspective of refugees and migrants in South Africa, of which the organization that I work for, which is COMSA, which is the Consortium for Refugees and Migrants in South Africa, works to promote and protect the human rights of asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants. And when we talk about migrants, we are referring to the whole group of movement of people who have left their country of origin, which includes any international communities that have come to South Africa, which basically means economic migrants, and those who are undocumented and stateless, who falls within the cracks. Hence, we termed the word migrants so that we can be inclusive. So my presentation is going to be very quick, but it's long, but I will be trying my best to work within the 15 minutes that has been allocated to me. I will do the COMSA introduction, World Refugee Day purpose, which Norma has already touched to it. I will skip that one. And then I just thought maybe for 1 second or 30 seconds, I will also share a screen for those maybe who will be asking themselves a question of who's an asylum seeker and who's a refugee. And then I will also talk to the international and national migration policy framework, which are within the context of migration and then refugee and migrant situation on the ground. And then I will share some recommendation on that regard. Just briefly, COMSA is a national network of organization in good standing. So we have got 26 member organization whose mandate is to promote and to protect the human rights of asylum seekers, refugees, and other international migrants in a way to promote the well-being of all in South Africa, the region, and globally. Network building, capacity building, community engagement, and dialogues, rights awareness, and information sharing. COMSA members include legal practitioners. When Nomash was doing the introduction and introducing Tandega, she even mentioned that Tandega once worked for Lawyers for Human Rights. They are our good member in good standing. So it includes community-based refugee and migrant-led organizations, advice offices, academic institutions, and social service providers, amongst others, including activists themselves. And then the purpose of the World Refugee Day, as Norma has rightfully indicated, the day is celebrated on the 20th of June. And then the objective of this day, it's meant to build empathy, understanding for their plight, and to recognize they are resilient and rebuilding their lives. Also to create opportunity to support refugees. Every year, this day comes with each theme. The theme for 2021 is Together We Heal, Learn and Shine. And if you read on the issue of Together We Heal, Learn and Shine, and you compare it to the situation that took place or the incidences that took place yesterday, it's totally the opposite of what the World Refugee Day meant to commemorate, because it means to celebrate the strength and courage of people who have been forced to flee their home country and escape conflict and persecution. What is happening on the ground on that regard as we speak? I thought it would be important because yesterday, the whole day, I was on the ground when all these attacks were taking place in Soweto. This started by the Operation Dudula, which was debated in social media and circulated. And if you can see on the first slide, on the first picture there, where it was talking about drug peddlers, no foreigners in our businesses, no illegal occupation of buildings and stall and so forth. And then we had the Operation Dudula, which then gained the momentum, which led to the situations and the displacement of people on the 16th of June, yesterday during the Youth Day, where we were commemorating and celebrating the achievement that were achieved by the youth of 1976. If you can see, these are the people who have been forcefully evicted. Some are refugees, some are economic migrants, which I have engaged with yesterday in Soweto. You can see all their belongings were put outside. This is the group of people at the bottom corner left that went around removing people from their area of residence. And believe you me, all these people who have been invited, they are people who did not occupy this building or where they are living illegal. They are people who are paying rent, monthly rentals to the people who owns the building. Like most of them, they are renting the backyard rooms and the mikukus. We normally call them shacks. So they were forcefully removed out of their place of residence, which was very much painful because yesterday I had to work until late so that to see that these people get refugee and some of them they escape this behavior unharmed. This is me and Father, where we were trying to counter the Operation Dudula movement. And then this is the definition of a refugee, which I think I should skip for the sake of time in terms of who's a refugee. But the most important thing in terms of describing who's a refugee is a person who has been, his application has been found and then has been granted with the refugee status on the grounds of fear of persecution from back home, in a matter of whether the person belongs to a particular political party or a particular social orientation group. And then asylum seeker is a person who's awaiting the approval of an application to become a refugee. International and national migration policies. The reason I brought this up is because in most occasions when we engage in a community level, the local citizens, especially the host citizens, they tend to ask a question that, why do refugees and migrants come to South Africa? This is the answer of why do migrants and refugees and asylum seekers come to South Africa. And remember, they don't just come to South Africa only. Quite a number of countries, they host migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. South Africa is a signatory to the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees of 1951. It is also a member of the Organization of African Union, a convention governing the specific aspect of refugee problems in Africa of 1996, and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights as adopted by the General Assembly of United Nations in 1948, and then the UN protocol relating to the status of refugees. This is what guides South Africa to belong to the international community when it relates to issues of migration. It's a signatory to this convention, which are binding to most of the countries. And then on a national level, those international treaties, they then guide each country that is a signatory to those international conventions to develop their own domestic policies. On top of the list, we have got the Constitution of South Africa, which has got the Bill of Rights, and then which Section 28, Rights of the Child, that talks to mainly what are the rights of the children and so forth. I singled out this Section 28 because in many occasions, most challenges that children face that are born out of migrant communities, issues of access to birth certificates, access to education, healthcare, are mostly affecting children greatly so. And then we have got the Refugee Act of 1998, which has been amended. And then the new amendment came into effect on the 1st of January 2020, of which COMSA, through its legal partners, they are litigating its constitutionality because it contained quite a number of gaps. For example, if to mention one, the amendment is going to segregate refugees and asylum seekers not belonging to one group, and it's also going to limit the right to work for refugees. They will have to prove why they will want to work in South Africa. And then we have got the Immigration Act of number 13 of 2002, and then we have got the critical law, which is called the Birth and Death Registration Amendment Act of 2010. And then we have got the white paper on international migration for South Africa. And then most importantly, because everyone, including us South African, when we apply for documentation, if our documentation were to be refused or our application is to be refused, we need to get a written reason why our application has been refused. Hence the importance of the PAJA Act, the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act. Refugee and migrant situation on the ground. This is where we are mostly, when we commemorate Refugee Day, we look at what is happening. Are refugees integrated in the community? Are refugees welcome in our communities? The first on the list, which is a very problematic one, which normally creates divisions and create false alarm within the community level, is the lack of a comprehensive state on migration in South Africa. Why so? It is difficult to obtain how many refugees, asylum seekers, and economic migrants in South Africa through the Department of Home Affairs, who are the custodian of the migration processes. We normally rely on UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, to receive stats. And at Home Affairs, it's difficult to receive stats. This then raises an alarm, which is not verified, that we have got so many refugees in our community, which is not verified. And then we have got denial of access to refugee reception centers around the country. As you are aware, recently through the COVID-19, all refugee reception offices were closed and their services were suspended until further notice. And all the permits were extended through the blanket extension until the end of June, which we are just two weeks away from it. Why we say denial of access to refugee reception centers, this is where refugees and asylum seekers get to be documented and they can be legalized in the country. There is a high application rejection rate leading to the growing number of undocumented asylum seekers and refugees, which then leads to the more arrest and detention. We have got lack of integration policy on migrants and refugees in our communities, even though we have got the National Action Plan to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and so forth. That policy was adopted, I believe, in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. But is the policy well adopted and integrated within the departments? The answer is it's very limited. Migrant and refugee are seen as the problem of South Africa's development, especially scapegoating service delivery at the expense of migrants. We have seen and we have heard this statement from our political leaders who have been elected by the ordinary citizens who are South Africans to lead and guide them in the new future. But instead of delivering the services that they were elected to do, they then scapegoat migrants in delivering the services. We have heard in the past, if I may to mention, previously, Honorable Premier of Gauteng, Mr. David Makura, he once said that access to healthcare services, the cost of those that relates to migrants must be paid by the countries where people are coming from, which cannot work like that when we have got the National Healthcare Act and we have got the Constitution, which talks to the access to healthcare services for all. And then we have got denial of access to critical life and life-saving basic services, which we have practically experienced as the organization that works nationally, regionally, and continentally. Access to basic healthcare service, access to basic education. This has to take a court case that was done in Eastern Cape in Alwal North so that children without documentation, they can be allowed access to education because they were seculars, including the dependents of asylum seekers and refugees. They were denied access to access education. On that regard, the case was heard in court and the High Court ruled that all children, as per the Constitution, they've got the right to access basic education, including the South African Schools Act that talks to how child should be admitted to the schools. And then access to employment, which is a very critical one, in terms of exploitation of migrants, especially refugees and asylum seekers, because employers tend to know that refugees and asylum seekers, they are here on a temporary basis. They get to be exploited, not to be paid well. And then the issue of access to UIF, this as well has to take a court case that was done by Cliff Dagger, Hofmeyer Otenis. I think in 2019, if my memory serves me well in terms of the dates, because asylum seekers and refugees, including economic migrants, will be employed, contributing to the UIF scheme, but when it's time for them to claim their benefits, they will be denied access to receive their benefits, which was contrary to the Act and the Constitution. And then access to banking. Majority of the asylum seekers and refugees, they don't have bank account because of their documentation status. Few of them, they do access banks, depending on what kind of a bank and what kind of a person assisting them on the day. And then access to shelter is a very big one because most of them, they don't qualify to receive what we normally call RDP houses. And then also the enabling and verifiable documents, birth certificate and payments. Ongoing xenophobia, as I indicated when I started my presentation, that we are commemorating this day on the amid of the situation that took place yesterday in Soweto, where quite a number of refugees, asylum seekers, and economic migrants were displaced and removed from their place of residence. South Africa leadership and its government should and must accept and admit that xenophobia does exist. Admitting the existence of the problem will suggest way on how the problem can be solved. Why this statement I'm making? In many occasions or in many areas, you find that politicians, they refuse that xenophobia in South Africa does exist. They normally cite it to the criminal elements. And if it is a criminal element, why are the people involved in those criminal elements are not being held accountable? Because we do have the National Criminal Procedures Act, which hold the people who are inciting violence, who are creating crimes, who are doing all sorts of things that are outside the law. So we are saying, and we are also recommending that if the government of South Africa can and must admit that xenophobia does exist, they will be able to develop an integrated strategy to address that. And then false and unverified statements about migrants and refugees are being made out there. For example, refugees and asylum seekers are taking away our jobs. What kind of jobs? There has to be a scientific study in terms of identifying the kind of jobs that refugees and asylum seekers, including migrants, are engaged on. When we do practical work on the ground, most often it's an informal work and self-employment work. And then access to justice for victims of xenophobia. This is a very critical one because mostly the perpetrators of xenophobia, they are just released from the court processes on warning and inciting public violence. And there is no recourse for the victims. Lack of accountability of perpetrators. And then migrant and refugee policy development. In the past 4 or 5 years and up to date, as COMSA, we have witnessed and experienced a very gross development of anti-migration policies by the Department of Home Affairs and other departments. I can assure you that in the past 2 or 3 years, we have had, I think, 8 or 9 policy submissions in revising the current Refugee and then the Immigration Act, including the
25. Gitsi.
Hello? And then very limited time for public comments and submission. In many occasions, we found that the call for policy submission will be put out and we are given the, hello? Hello? Am I still audible? And then we have seen quite a number of development of anti-migrant and refugee policies, public servants' sense of entitlement, refusal of service based on the nationality, implementation of draft policies. This has been happening and it has been the norm that once the government proposes a certain policy, the public servants goes ahead and implement the proposed policy without it being adopted first. And then we have come out with quite a number of recommendations. This is my second from last slide. Dr. Paul Zangwati in 2008, during her presentation at the International Conference on Migration, Southern Perspective on Migration, entitled Context and Not Cost, argues that local government in South Africa can and should take a broad cohesion-sensitive approach to service delivery planning and public participation, and that an awareness of community-level migration dynamic is an integral component of this approach. This is what we have been witnessing not being done and implemented in South Africa. As I'm rushing through time, recently, on my, if I can go through these 2 last slides, 1 minute. On the recommendation.
We have 1 minute.
Yes,
okay.
We recently on the publication that was done by Daily Maverick, Judge Navi Pillay has actually ushered out this word to say whatever group or regional loyalty South Africa supports, this must not be at the expense of adherence to its state commitment to constitutional rights and values and promise of their implementation. This article states that human rights will be the light that guides our foreign affairs. But what we are seeing on the ground level, our migration and human rights approach is not done on a very social integration manner. These are some of the recommendations that we are submitting that we have seen happening. And we believe that if this recommendation can be taken up by our government, the integration of migration on the community level will be smoothly and it can be coordinated very well. And then we also have further recommendation. People can read through very quickly, but the presentation, I believe maybe it can be shared after I presented. Because of time, this is the question: are we fighting a winnable battle? If yes, decision makers and policy must join the debate. Actors in cooperation live up to expectation. We are talking about the Chapter 9 institutions, South African Human Rights Commission, the Commission for Gender Equality, the Linguistic Commission. If they join the debate and live up to the expectation, human rights and integration of migrants, it can be a reality. And the rights holders are empowered to know and claim their rights democratically and fair. And rule of law is upheld. If we are not fighting a winnable battle, this is the opposite of the above. This is my last slide. This is the report that was done by the Human Rights Watch recently, which was submitted to the government of South Africa, because they have conducted a very thorough, comprehensive research relating to non-integrative method of migrants and refugees and asylum seekers in community. And they've made quite a number of recommendations. And for the purpose of this presentation, I just quoted the few recommendations that I will leave on the screen. And this is the way people can get to see the report. Thank you very much, Program Director.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sintumule. That was very interesting. You already have 2 questions. I think you shared some of the many challenges that refugees are facing in South Africa. So while we remembering the struggles and the trauma that they face in their countries of origin, we are also realizing through your presentation that the struggle actually doesn't end when you enter the border in South Africa. There's still more challenges for refugees in South Africa. So that is why it's great that on our panel, the second panelist is Ms. Nomagugu Mlawe from Lawyers for Human Rights. So she is an attorney of the High Court and has been with Lawyers for Human Rights for 8 years, serving as a senior attorney under their refugee and migrant rights program. She has sat on very important strategic meetings internationally, including the global meeting that is held by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee, which is held in Geneva, Switzerland. So thank you so much, Ms. Mlawe. Please take over.
Thank you for the introduction, Ms. Duma, and thank you to the university for providing us this platform today. Indeed, it's very important, not just to South Africa, but globally to commemorate World Refugee Day and to really speak to the issues and challenges that face refugees in a global context. So just, starting with my topic, when we speak of access to health, education, and social services for refugees and migrants, we are in essence examining the state of refugee protection. We are in essence examining the state of refugee protection, and my presentation today will look at the current state of refugee protection in South Africa. I am just going to share it here on my share screen. So as my colleague from COMSA has pointed out, the asylum application system in South Africa is currently riddled with challenges, and the current legislation and policies are regressive in nature as opposed to the initial refugee law that were rights-based and progressive in nature. So we are seeing a shift in South Africa, a very sad shift, if we may say, because what's happening is that we're seeing that our policies are now putting in restraints on refugee rights. Our policies are constraining and are not generous towards refugee rights, and almost we are getting this paper wall being built through policies when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers in South Africa. And I will just take you through some of the legislative measures to this effect, like, for instance, the Refugee Amendment Act that my colleague has made mention of, and I will give examples later on in the presentation as to the various challenges that has been posed by the Refugee Amendment Act. We've got the Border Management Agency Bill, which is proposing that refugee reception officers actually move to borders and everything be managed from the borders. We've got the white paper on international migration and other various legislative instruments that are really hampering and hindering the progressive nature of refugee rights. So currently, what our asylum seeker system looks like in South Africa is that ideally, previously, as a refugee, you would come into the country, approach a refugee reception office, and make an application to be recognized as a refugee in South Africa. What has since happened over the years is that firstly, this process, due to capacity constraints, is not as streamlined, and applications are not being attended to as immediate as they should be. So we've got people sitting in the system that haven't even processed their applications. You find that an asylum seeker got to South Africa in 2017, 2018, but they still are waiting to actually process an application at the refugee reception office. And this is for a various number of reasons. There's not enough refugee reception offices around the country. Some refugee reception offices have closed in the urban areas. And even though there's been institutions like LHR who have taken the Department of Home Affairs to court to have these centers opened, the department refuses to reopen these centers, and therefore access becomes an issue for many refugees. And then what happens is that we've got people who remain undocumented, not because they want to be undocumented, not because they voluntarily undocumented, but basically because they cannot access the refugee reception offices, which are the only offices in the country mandated and have the authority to process applications and to issue documentation for refugees and asylum seekers in South Africa. So as you can imagine, lack of documentation results in various access challenges: health, education, economy, and social services. You basically have insecure tenure in the country. You know, without a document, you can't readily access health. Without a document, your children have you know, challenges in accessing education, and our office deals with these cases on a day-to-day basis. This is the bulk of the issues we deal with, where we get approached by clients saying, I've been in the country for a year, I've been in the country for 2 years, but I don't have documentation. I've tried to approach Home Affairs, and I just haven't been able to actually get my application processed. And this is pre-COVID. So later on, I will even deal with the more complex situation and the more prejudicial situation that COVID has placed on refugees and migrants in the country. So pre-COVID, looking at 2018, 2019, what started happening at the refugee reception offices, and more so speaking to Durban, the office started giving appointments and would only process applications on an appointment basis. And we talking here numbers of about 20 people a day or 30 people a day, depending on staff capacity. And what this caused is that you would have over 100 people looking to process applications, but only 20 people being attended to. And we've had this backlog, I think, right from 2017, where there's just been the cycle of people who are initially given appointments or not given appointments and are still not able to process their applications. So these are really the challenges that then hamper on saying, do refugees and migrants really have access in South Africa, and are they really protected? So how the asylum application system works is that once your application has been processed and received by the Department of Home Affairs, within 180 days, a determination is supposed to be made as to whether your application is successful or has been rejected. And you have two avenues. If your application has been rejected, you can appeal through the Refugee Appeals Authority of South Africa, or it gets sent to the Standing Committee for Refugee Affairs, or then eventually, if you also want to appeal that, you lodge a judicial review. So what's been happening? Because again, due to capacity constraints, this has not been the case. Applications have been sitting in the system for over 8 years, for over 9 years, for over 10 years, and some even up to close to 15 years, where a person is waiting for a decision from Home Affairs. And while you're waiting for this decision from Home Affairs, you are on this temporary document, which is called Section 22 asylum seeker permits. It's a temporary permit that gets renewed every 3 to 6 months. And again, which is a huge challenge for most asylum seekers who are already vulnerable, because this requires that you travel every 3 to 6 months to renew this permit. So for instance, when you arrived in South Africa, and maybe you had processed your documentation in Musina, or you had processed your documentation in Pretoria or Johannesburg, which is now jointly known as the Marabastad RO, you are then expected to travel every 3 to 6 months with your family to renew this permit. And this is a huge burden because you need to factor in transport costs, you need to factor in accommodation costs, etc. So these are just, again, very, very prejudicial elements that we see in the system. And then again, you're stuck in a legal limbo. Some people are not able to meet the financial need to renew the permits. And that's how, again, you get with undocumented people in the system, not due to any fault of their own, but due to a lack of resources. And just the slide to show you the current statistics and reflections of the applications lodged in 2017, and the rejections that were also given. Again, some statistics from the Auditor General just to show the massive backlog currently that Home Affairs has when it comes to processing appeals. So this is from the Refugee Appeals Authority, and they are currently sitting with 147,794 appeals in their system. And it's really just shocking, and it's really sad. For the sake of time, I will go to, I've addressed the RO closures and the implications that has had. My previous colleague from COMSA did explain that the Refugee Amendment Act has been regressive in nature. We've seen many changes. The right to work is no longer automatic. The right to study is no longer automatic. You now need to make an application to the Director General. Various endorsements are needed, whereas previously all these rights came with being a refugee or a recognized asylum seeker in South Africa. And there are many other restrictions, but because for the purposes of time, I will not go into these restrictions. So as I've been saying, we do not foresee the Amendment Act having positive impact generally, with regards to the protection of refugees and asylum seekers in South Africa. In fact, it's actually shrinking the space. And when we speak to xenophobia, this is almost institutionalized xenophobia. As I've said, we're almost seeing a paper wall being built through our very own legislative instruments. So as I close up, I earlier on mentioned the situation that has been in existence since 2020. So the refugee reception offices have remained closed since the initial lockdown, and this was back in March 2020. So refugees and asylum seekers in South Africa haven't been able to renew their permits since 2020, and they've been sitting with expired permits. This has had numerous implications. Some people's bank didn't have job security, the risks of arrest and detention, and again, during 2020, right up until leading into 2021, these are the day-to-day cases that we deal with at the office. People coming in saying, my employer is saying your permit is expired, you cannot continue to work here. And again, from the department, lack of communication to institutions like the banking society, like the Department of Labor, actually saying and sensitizing institutions to say, this is the situation and you should recognize documentation valid as per the various gazetted communiques issued by the Minister of Home Affairs. It goes without saying that all that we have spoken about and all that I've discussed in my presentation has huge psychological impact on refugees and asylum seekers. These challenges may even make them far worse than when they actually entered the country. And it may be trigger situations for some individuals. It's even worse for children. And there's also in the system vulnerable single mothers. So it's just, again, you know, creating that cycle of a vulnerable group of people who really have nowhere else to turn to besides civil society and NGOs, because there are no proper systems in place in the country. So an urgent change is needed in terms of our implementation systems, and we are hoping that the regressive nature of the policies we're seeing, that we will be able to successfully challenge them in courts and hope for better outcomes for all refugees and migrants in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Imlawa, for that presentation. I think we learned that while countries such as the US building actual walls, South Africa is building an institutional one, and the space for refugees legally is shrinking. So thank you so much. I think it shows that as a refugee, it is important that we remember the refugees that are within our country, because they are a very resilient group that we should honor and remember on this day. And that is why the third and last speaker for the day, I think, fits the description of resilience. I mean, if you look at the fact that he is from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kinshasa, and he left his country of birth due to political unrest, and he's been living in South Africa for 15 years as a refugee, but he is studying towards a master's degree in social science. So he has managed to survive and is now trying to further his studies in the country. So Mr. Bukuru, thank you so much. I'm handing over the platform to you.
Thank you very much. So as today we're celebrating World Refugee Day, as I'm a refugee, I'm happy to participating in these conversations. My name is Bukuru Mulumbu. I'm a master's student at the UKZN Howard College, and I'm a peace ambassador at Zo Life Social Cohesion. As we see on the screen, in this presentation, I will be talking about my perspective as a refugee and also all challenging living as a refugee who has been participating in different tertiary student social cohesion workshop and dialogue organization by Forge Life Social Cohesion project funded by UNCR. Firstly, I'm recognized as a refugee in the Republic of South Africa. I'm holding refugee status and a Maroon refugee ID that expire every 4 years. The above documents give me the right to study and work in South Africa. The same documents serve as a bias to my success because of policy implementation, poor service delivery and corruption, lack of awareness of refugee rights in different institutions. Exclusive culture. In almost all universities in South Africa, there are only 2 tables prepared for the students. 1 table for citizens, those who having green IDs, and the second table for international students, those with foreigner passports. There is no table for refugee students, those who has Maroon IDs who refugee status. Admission to the university loan bursary will remain high issue if there will be no table to save refugee in our tertiary institutions. Refugee students view as burdens due to lack of relevant information, poverty, and the socio-economic inequality in South Africa, culture of corruption. Refugee students have been confused by South African as the root cause of all their suffering. We are experiencing negligence in all service. We are experiencing all negligence welfare refugee in South Africa schools. South Africa exceptionalism. South Africans feel superior in relation to other Africans due to language bias, refugee voice in neglected among local students, living with fear and trauma in universities. Refugee students become scapegoats. We are accused of anything. Psychological effects. Refugee students feel lonely and hopeless in the sense that they long for a place that they can identify with and call home. Feeling belonging are important to refugee students because they could not belong in their home country anymore. Social effects. Refugee students demonstrate anxiety, depression, which make it difficult to lead normal students' life in the campus. Effect on the African common. South Africans rely on professionals from other African countries to develop in academy. There is always a strong condemnation from all SADC countries and from the continent in large. Effect of the global community. The world has become global village to South African lose a lot of in terms of reputation wherever refugee or foreign academic in a telco excluded. Student dialogue, creation of safe platform where both local and refugee students can sit and run generative conversation. Forge Peace Ambassador Academy, this will be a wonderful opportunity to welcome all university through their training. We understand the benefits of cohesive African different category of people such as citizen, economic migrants, asylum seeker, refugees, internal displaced people, settlers people, and what the Constitution of South Africa say about them. This program is offered by ZooLife and the UNHCR. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bukuru, for your presentation. So we're going to have an question and answer session that is going to be directed towards the three panelists. So I'm going to go to the question and answer and read out a few questions. And then I'm going to allow the panelists, if the question is directed towards you, if you can please answer that question. So the first question is from Bigirimana Matthias. And it says, why organizations like yours cannot take the government to the international court if those who are harmed are left by the local courts? So I think this question is directed both to Lawyers for Human Rights as well as COMSA. So can either Ms. Mlawe or Mr. Sintumule address those questions?
Maybe I can allow my legal partner to address this legally.
Ms. Duma, can I come in quickly?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think we're supposed to have a response before the questions. If you check the program, I think we missed one person on that on the agenda or on the program.
Oh yes, we're supposed to have a summary response by Dr.
Yes.
Rash.
Yeah. I think he is online. Maybe we can just ask him to come through, and then we can then address the Q&A after that.
All right, no problem. Please go ahead, Dr. Simba Rashid Tembo, lecturer at the School of Law.
All right, thank you, Tandeka. If I may just confirm that you can all hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, wonderful. All right, let me start by, let me begin by thanking the University of KwaZulu-Natal for putting this together, especially the phenomenal panel that we've read. This shows that the university is pragmatic and flexible and has taken us beyond the isms and discourses. Today, we have heard presentations from experts and those with lived experience in the subject matter today. Well done to the corporate relations for this. And this webinar could not have come at a better time, as South Africa is currently tainted by xenophobic and anti-immigrant sentiments. In some cases, this has led to periodic bouts of violence leading to serious displacements. From a global perspective, there are currently 79.5 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, including 45.7 million who are internally displaced people, and 26 million refugees and 4.2 million asylum seekers. South Africa has been a preferred destination of immigrants, particularly here in the SADC region. An estimated 2 million foreign-born migrants of the working age of between 15 and 64 were living in South Africa in 2017, which, according to statistics, represent 5.3% of the South African labor force. And between 2012 and 2017, there was about 1.4% increase in international migrants of working age in South Africa. And unofficially, the numbers are actually much higher than that. The reason why we have such a huge flow of immigrants and migrants and refugees to South Africa is because of South Africa's commitment to upholding human rights and the rights of asylum seekers and refugees, which make the country an attractive destination for people fleeing their home countries in the quest for a more dignifying and humane existence. And the economy of South Africa as well, which is one of the most advanced on the continent, has contributed to the exponential increase in the number of people seeking asylum from the continent and the world at large. According to Mukumbang and others, they've argued that the unprecedented flow of asylum seekers and refugees into South Africa has compromised the government's stance to adhere to its commitments towards upholding human rights while delivering its promise to uplift the socio-economic welfare of its citizens, especially those that still feel the brunt of apartheid. So while there is the political will to accommodate and cater for asylum seekers, refugees, and undocumented migrants in South Africa, the increasing economic and financial woes of the country has led to the government adopting and frequently changing laws in many ways. And we have had a number of laws that are being put in place to form the structural barrier to the flow of immigrants and refugees in the country. Now, we have had a number of presentations. We have read a presentation from our first speaker, Mr. Simtumole, who has outlined the challenges that refugees and asylum seekers face in South Africa, including a very serious issue of xenophobia that was experienced yesterday in Soweto. And this is quite disheartening that we are at the middle of celebrating World Refugee Day, and we have such things happening. We have also heard that the other challenges that have been faced by civil society is that there's lack of comprehensive statistics from the Home Affairs itself and from the Stats Department, and they've had to rely on international organization statistics. And there's also the denial at a political level that the issue of xenophobia does exist. And the issue of COVID-19 and its effects on refugees has also been raised. And we have heard that a number of refugees have been displaced and others have lost jobs and have lost their livelihood due to the COVID-19 and the related lockdown. And this has led to denial of access to services, health, education, shelter, and in some cases, the relevant documents that refugees and immigrants need. We have read that a recommendation that in the starting point for making the lives of immigrants and refugees better in South Africa would be by the government admitting that xenophobia does exist. I think this is very critical in the sense that in order for there to be truth and reconciliation, people have to start by facing the facts and admitting to them, and that can give rise to a very good discussion with all stakeholders in order to find ways of mitigating the challenges that are associated with xenophobia and also the rights of immigrants. We had the second speaker, Ms. Nomago Gumlawe from the Lawyers for Human Rights. She has given us a very wonderful presentation on refugees' access to health, education, and social services. And she has also given us a very elaborate legislative framework that acts as a barrier to the implementation of refugee rights. And she has also outlined for us the challenges that are associated with implementation of refugee rights, including resources, lack of staff capacity, and backlogs that have made things difficult in processing of immigrant documents. We have had quite an emotional presentation from our third speaker, Mr. Bukuru. And Mr. Bukuru has basically outlined what students who find themselves with the name tag refugee experience here in South Africa, and particularly in institutions of higher learning. So it's quite unfortunate that as institutions of higher learning, we are expected to have at least an understanding of what entails, for one to be a refugee, what are the factors and circumstances that may have led them to, come to South Africa and find refugee here. But it seems that staff and fellow students within the refugee higher institutions of higher learning also lack conscientization. They just do not understand what this whole thing entails. And we have read that the refugee status that Mr. Bukuru carries has led to a number of discriminatory practices against him. And that's quite unfortunate that we have read that he's also been scapegoated, and this has given rise to a number of psychological problems. I think I'll end here, and I'll ask our facilitator to facilitate the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tembo. You summarized the conversation in such a precise and articulate way. If I were to add on, I think I would do an injustice. So thank you so much, Mr. Tembo. So we're going to proceed to our question and answer session. I don't know if Ms. Zondo is going to join me on the question and answer session. Can I hear from you, Ms. Zondo?
Hi, Ms. Duma. Yes, I am here.
Okay, all right. So the first question is about the government being taken to court. And I said Mr. Simtule or Ms. Mlawe can address that question. Mr. Simtumule or Ms. Mlawe, can you please address the first question?
Well, mainly we have two platforms internationally. We have the International Court of Justice, and then we have the International Criminal Court. So I am not sure which courts Mr. Matthias was referring to, but I'll just briefly explain as to the mechanisms for these courts. So the ICJ, the International Court for Justice, unfortunately, it's states who have to bring cases between the ICJ. So an institution like ours or other private institutions, or in fact a private individual would not be able to approach the ICJ. It would, in fact, need to be a member state or the South African states approaching the ICJ. As for the International Criminal Court, and I'm sure many of my colleagues who are joining this webinar, there are many platforms that need to be exhausted before you approach the International Criminal Court. Without laboring this question and answer session, it's really a court of last resort, and what they prosecute is things like war crimes, genocides, just to give examples. So I hope I've answered your question, Mr. Matthias.
Thank you for that, Ms. Mlawe. I think that you have addressed the question for Mr. Matthias. If there's any follow-up, he's going to write on the question and answer tab. So the second question is from James Ndlovu, and he has a question for Mr. Simtumule, and he said that you mentioned the fact that the Refugees Act was amended in 2020, and that COMSA will be disputing some of its provisions. And he's asking, why are you only disputing now? Were you not consultant? And what measures do you have in place to ensure that the amendments are reversed, if that is possible? And then the second question is, you mentioned the fact that there is a high rejection rate. I think this is for refugee applications. And he's asking, what is the cause of such rejections? And what has your organizations done in order to assist the refugees that are rejected? Mr. Simtumule, that is your question.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, James, for the questions that you have raised directed to me. And thank you. So maybe to address the first question, the amendment of the Refugee Act was published for public comments. Everyone was invited to make their own comments to the proposed amendment on the Refugee Act, of which we as COMSA, together with other partner organizations and individuals and citizens, we did make submission disputing certain sections that the government proposed during the amendment submissions process. What happened next? All our submissions were ignored. Then the government, through the Portfolio Committee of Home Affairs, led by the Department of Home Affairs, they went ahead and adopt what they have proposed and put forward as proposed amendment to the Refugee Act. We disputed that through the submissions we made. Unfortunately, in January 2020, on a New Year's Day, when we wake up, we found that the refugee amendment has been adopted and is coming into effect on the 1st of January 2020. To this, what we are doing to dispute this is through the litigation process, of which Noma Gugu also touched to it. We are litigating through the assistance of our legal partners, Lawyers for Human Rights, the Scalabrini Center of Cape Town, so that we can dispute certain sections that we have made submission based on their constitutionality. And on the first application of these litigations, COMSA was admitted. We won the part A of that litigation, of which COMSA was admitted as the amicus curiae to this matter. And then recently, it's unfortunate that I don't have my legal team here. Recently, Home Affairs appealed the decisions, but unfortunately they lost the appeal. So the matter will be going ahead with part B with regard to the unconstitutionality of the amendment. So we are still waiting for the date to hear what the court will say about our submissions that we have made through the litigation process. And then you asked a question of high rejection rate. This came to us through clients. Remember, we don't have access to the Home Affairs database. We only receive or get notified by the clients who get rejected from the refugee reception offices through the RSD or Refugee Status Determination Office, hence through the presentation that was done by my colleagues from Lawyers for Human Rights. she was indicated the issues of high rejection rates, comparing the statistics. If you can see, the numbers were so high in terms of the rejection. So what are we doing in addressing that? We have had a meeting with Home Affairs before the COVID-19 in addressing this high rejection rate. It was in January, if I'm not mistaken. We had a very high level stakeholder with the Home Affairs management, and we raised this issue. They were going to look into the issue because the same rejection rate and the same reasoning in rejecting those applications was the same. There were a lot of unified kind of writing in terms of the rejection. You could see that possible, if not mistaken, it was one person rejecting because the same style of writing was applicable to quite a number of rejections. And then what we're also doing, we just recently met with Home Affairs now through online meetings when they are now proposing to bring on a new law which is called Official Identity Management Bill, which is going to address issues of access to birth certificate and birth registration. This issue of high rejection rate was also raised when the Home Affairs announced the online applications, the online extension of the refugee status and asylum seeker status. So they also said that they're going to be looking at it. So it's an issue that we are working on. We are trying to see how best can we resolve this issue through the engagement with the Department of Home Affairs on a high level process, like what my colleague from Home Affairs has indicated, that we need to first exhaust all processes on the ground before maybe we can approach higher court and other law enforcement agencies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Simtumule. I don't know if Mr. Mlau has anything to add, but I think you've covered all the questions. Mr. Mlau, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
All right, let's move on to the next question, which is basically asking whether there's any urgent plans to quickly identify illegal migrants within our community, because according to Thokozani Mkhize, the South African Police Services and other security agencies are overwhelmed by internal crime issues. Can I ask that Ms. Mlau, you address that question?
I am a bit not clear on Mr. Mkhize's question. If he's saying we should identify people within the community who are undocumented or have expired documentation, and then assist them, or if he's saying we should be doing work with the security cluster and the security agencies when it comes to arrests in regards to refugee and migrants. So the question is not very clear to me, Ms. Duma. Maybe you can clarify for me.
I think Mr. Mkhize is saying, is there an urgent plan, measures in place to basically maybe find out who is an illegal foreigner before people within the community take the law into their own hands?
I think that I think firstly that exercise in its own would be discriminatory in my opinion, and I think that exercise in its own would lend itself to providing a platform for xenophobia. So in my opinion, I don't know about other panelists, but in my opinion, I would not say it's an exercise that one should embark on because of the current dangers that it poses and the exploitation it can be landed to. But yeah, I welcome other colleagues to have their say in this.
Yes, through you, Chair. Just to say, I agree with what my colleague is saying, because in the past, we have seen how this tends to be a very bad exercise and fuel violence and attacks on foreign nationals. If you will remember, we once had Operation Fiela in Gauteng, where the Johannesburg Metro Police and other law enforcement agencies went on a spree of document verifications, which led to a lot of challenges and a lot of eyebrow raising in a community level, because they didn't have the capacity to verify which one is a legal documentation, which one is not a legal documentation. So that whole mandate is within the immigration officials that is led by the Department of Home Affairs. We as the community, it is very difficult on a community level to identify who is a legal migrant, who is an illegal migrant. But if the immigration officials themselves within the Home Affairs are the one to be involved in these processes, I think that's how formally it will be carried out. Because why I'm saying this, there are a lot of international treaties and there are a lot of political agreement. If you look at the SADC political agreement of the free movement of persons within the SADC regions using their home country passport, but they had to report within the borders of each countries. How do you then verify such kind of movement in terms of the legality? So there are a lot of challenges that gets to be involved within. So immigration officials within the Home Affairs will be the right people to engage in such exercise to avoid disturbances and social ills erupting from the ground level.
Thank you so much. So the next question from Matthias, I think he left the group. He asked, how long do you think Home Affairs is going to be closed? And why is it closed for vulnerable groups like refugees and asylum seekers? Is it fair? And I'm going to ask Ms. Mlawa if you can address that. Ms. Mlawa, can you please address the question?
Well, initially when the refugee reception offices were closed, also the civic department of Home Affairs was also closed. And this is during COVID outbreak and the various alert levels. So what Home Affairs has submitted is that the refugee reception offices remain closed because of the nature and capacity of the volume of the work and the people coming into the center, and it poses a risk, obviously, in terms of spreading COVID. That's the submission Home Affairs makes. Currently, there is an online system in place. So what they've developed is you can now extend your permits online, and that is happening. They haven't issued a date for reopening of the centers, but the online extension system is currently running for extension of permits.
Thank you, Ms. Mlawe. We have 2 more minutes on our question and answer session. I'm going to try and see if I can just summarize these questions that are remaining. So let me just go through them. So the one question is asking about whether the law allows for economic people to be granted refugee status based on economic reasons. So Ms. Mlawa is going to address that. And then the other question is it's not a question. He's just telling us about the challenges he's facing in Cape Town. Okay, can you just address the other question, the first question that I mentioned, Ms. Mlawe, while I go through the other?
Must I address the first part now?
Yes, the economic reason.
Okay, so the Refugee Act is very clear in terms of who is an asylum seeker and who is a refugee. And so are all the international instruments, including the United Nations instruments when it comes to the protection of refugees. And you cannot apply for asylum for economic reasons. They are economic migrants, but you cannot use South Africa's Refugee Act for economic reasons. Unfortunately, it has to be compliant with the sections in the Act, and economic reasons are excluded, expressly excluded in the Act. But you can apply for a work permit, and you can apply for a critical skills visa.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Mlawe. So the other question is asking about delays. You mentioned renewing your permits online. The gentleman from Cape Town is asking about, he says he has delays in getting feedback from Home Affairs. I don't know if you want to answer that, Ms. Mlawe, or you're going to ask that he approaches a refugee office, not a refugee office, lawyers for human rights or whatever office is available to address such queries.
Yes, agreed. The gentleman can approach our office for assistance and any other platform that he can get assistance from. But just to give a blanket answer, unfortunately, at this point in time, we don't know how long the turnaround time is for the system for the online extensions. So yes, we also can't provide any timeframes as to when your permits will be renewed, but we can follow up.
Okay, so I'm not going to be able to go through all the questions. Olivia is saying that she doesn't feel that justice was done to her question. I don't know if maybe Ms. Mlawe or Ms. Tufuleni will be able to discuss the question further with her later on. The last question that I'm going to include is whether our law allows citizens to beat those refugees and take their businesses without their permission. Mr. Simtumule, do you want to address that? You spoke of xenophobia during your presentation.
Thank you very much for the questions. The answer is no. There is no law that allows anyone to beat anyone. So any assault to anyone is a criminal offense, and charges will be laid against the perpetrator of such crimes. Which, when these things happen, so hence I mentioned in my presentation that when I was on the ground, we were making sure that the police presence becomes more visible so that it can discourage such kind of behavior to happen or to take place on the ground. For yesterday's protest and xenophobic utterances and behavior that was taking place in Soweto. So the answer is no, there is no such law.
Definitely, there is no such law, Mr. Sintumule. The last question from Ms. Mkakanya is, how do we get the SA government to be genuinely accountable and to uphold the Constitution in terms of abiding by the rule of law? They have adopted and developed internationally and regionally. So I'm going to ask Ms. Mlawe, do you want to address that one last question? Or Mr. Tufuleni, do you want to address the question?
I will address it and maybe my colleague will add. Domestically, the South African Human Rights Commission and the National Prosecuting Authority through the Department of Justice, they are the relevant institutions that needs to hold all government departments accountable in upholding the rule of law. Hence, in my presentations, in my last slide, I did mention that the actors in corporations must live to their expectations in terms of making sure that human rights are held and protected. So on the international level, maybe I can leave it to my colleague to address such on the international level. But through the African Union and the United Nations forums, this discussion needs to be escalated, and all these in human rights violations cases needs to be reported so that government can be accountable on an international level, which is something that when we attend and participate on the global and international forum, we do bring such kind of informations and statements so that government can be held accountable to respond in terms of the protection of asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants who are in the country.
Thank you. Norma, do you want to, Ms. Mlai, do you want to add anything? This is our last question. Do you have anything to add, Ms. Mlai?
Yes. As already answered, the internal mechanisms within the country and our own rule of law dictates that we must lodge complaints within the institutions provided in Chapter 9 of our Constitution. We also have the liberty to approach the courts, and I think organizations such as ours have largely relied on the judiciary in getting accountability and getting the departments, and not just Home Affairs but other government departments to account and actually to implement laws within the country. And I mean, that's the basis of our constitutional dispensation, is that where everything else has failed, the judiciary and the constitutional courts, being the highest courts in the land, will always be there to provide the necessary justice that's needed.
Thank you, Ms. Mlawe and Mr. Simtule for addressing all the questions that came through. I think this brings the question and answer session to an end, and I'm going to ask Ms. Norma Zondo to close and give a vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Ms. Duma. The discussions were really engaging, and I hope everyone enjoyed this afternoon. We hope that you've actually learned a lot, like myself. I mean, a lot of issues that came out which are more complex than we have time for. Hopefully, our participants we were able to engage our panelists later on or individually to get more assistance or answer any other questions. Unfortunately, the time did not allow us to go through all the questions, and thank you for those participants who took the time to ask the questions. I know you were asking questions that had to do with some things that are actually affecting you in personally, but we know that it also assisted others who were not able to be here with us to actually get some sort of questions or some sort of explanation of with actually some of these issues that are concerning refugees, and also any issues that are relating to refugee status as well as immigration. They're always complex. You cannot really deal with those issues in one day. It requires a lot of time and also people understanding regulations and various laws. So thank you so much for such a wonderful presentations to all the panelists. Thank you, Mr. Sintumule, Ms. Lawe, Mr. Mulumbu, as well as Dr. Tembu. Thank you so much. I'll also like to thank our fantastic facilitator, Ms. Duma. Thank you for making sure that we go through the sessions smoothly, and also making sure that we address most of the questions that we are being put on the Q&A. So we'd like to apologize if we didn't get to your question, but at least our panelists were very generous in providing explanations about most of the issues that you raised, and hopefully they were adequately addressed. But we will be putting this up on our YouTube channel maybe in the next 2 weeks or so. Feel free to go back and also maybe share with people who were not able to join us, so that they can also engage in, they can also have at least a preview of what was discussed today. I'd also like to thank Shakila and Pam for organizing the event or the webinar, and thank you and everyone for being here. I know you took time and your busy schedule to be with us, and I wish you a good afternoon, and stay safe, and please remember to social distance, and so that we all stay safe.